Baptist church out there when I drove up with so many cars out there. Praise God. I'm glad that it wasn't. Hallelujah. Praise God. Now, I can't think of anyone I'd rather teach than you people here. Praise God.
We'll receive that, brother.
Hallelujah. Well, good. I'd be out of a job, I guess. Praise God. Well, hallelujah. Go through orientation here. We just finished the Laodicean War. That's Daniel 11, verses 7 and 8. Now, you're going to need your chart because we're going to move into a new time period, into a new section here, and into the area of, well, about 3 new kings to get a little bit familiar with. Now, here in the Laodicean War, we've got Ptolemy III, who has gone up to Syria to fight against Seleucus II, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, the benefactor, and Seleucus II, Callinicus, the triumphant, which he really wasn't in all of these warfares here. But he's gone up to try to rescue his sister, and this is unsuccessful, and it produces the namesake, the Laodicean War, verses 7 and 8, where Ptolemy III is successful in the year 245 BC against Seleucus II. Then, the 9th verse, we still studied it in the context or in the section with the Laodicean War because, well, it really concerns the same war, not the same initial phase of it, but 5 years later, there was a counterattack. The king of the north, according to Daniel 11:9, our revision of it, understanding who the subject of that verse and that sentence really is, then resumes the war to some degree in a counterattack upon Ptolemy III, Euergetes, the benefactor. Now, do we all have Daniel 11:9 correctly down? The subject is the king of the north. The king of the north. The king of the north is going to go into the realm of the king of the south and accomplish, well, little of nothing, and then he's going to return to his own land. As a matter of fact, really that last phrase is indicative of what I've just explained, that he's not going to accomplish anything. He simply will go into the realm of the king of the south, and then he'll return to his own land. So King James is definitely incorrect with the subject being the king of the south. That makes no sense. It has to be the king of the north because that introduces us to verses 10 through 19, where we're going to be talking about some of the descendants of the king of the north and one in particular. So this battle of verse 9 took place in 240 BC. Okay, just like between verses 5 and 6, really not 6 and 7, verses 5 and 6, we had a large gap of time. We're going to have another gap of time, 20 years or so, between verses 9 and 10. But let me give this to you first, a little belatedly maybe, but I'll give it to you anyway. And that is the sections of Daniel 11, 2 through 35, the way they logically can be broken up. First of all, we have verses 2 to 4. And the reason I'm giving this to you now really is because we start into a new section, not only a new section, but we start into a long one as well. Verses 2 to 4 is the first section, which deals with the kings of Persia and the kings of Greece. We have our Persian kings, 3 kings, plus the 4th one far richer than they all. Then we have the mighty king of Greece, verse 3. Then we have the breaking up or the division of his kingdom in verse 4 toward the 4 winds of heaven. Then verses 5 to 9. The beginning of the warfare between Ptolemies and Seleucids. We have our second section, verses 5 to 9. It really can logically be broken up into this fashion. So you see from what I've said thus far, we just completed a section, verses 5 to 9. Then verses 10 through 20, and that's broken up, well, I'll give it to you anyway, not hardly into two sections. 10 to 19 concerns Antiochus the Great. That's why it's an important section, because all of that's devoted to one king, Antiochus the Great. We haven't seen that yet. That many verses devoted to one person. Verse 20 has to do with Seleucus IV, the next king in the Seleucid line, but really the whole section goes together, or you'd have to count verse 20 as an entity in itself. Verses 10 through 20, the third section. And then verses 21 through 35, which also deal with one king, as do verses 10 through 19. So in other words, you just have to understand the field of vision here. To begin with, in verses 2 and 4, it's very broad. It encompasses the Persian realm and the Greek realm, the Macedonian realm that comes after that. Then it gets narrowed down to the Ptolemaic kings and the Seleucid kings in verses 5 to 9. Then it zeroes in on one king, Antiochus, one Seleucid king, Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great, because he's going to be very, very important. The change over between hands, between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids concerning the possession of Palestine will take place during his reign. That's why it's significant. Then verse 20 just covers a little bit about Seleucus IV. Then verses 21 to 35 really zero in on probably the most important of these kings with regard to Israel, her history, and the persecutions through which she has to go. So that's the purpose probably of the amount of material being allotted to certain kings and to certain realms. It's a little more broad to begin with in the floodlight, and the spotlight narrows things down to important kings as we move along. So verses 10 through 19 will be a long section. Tonight we're going to study verse 10 to let you know what we're going to be looking at. Well, let's say first 2/3 anyway. Well, hallelujah. I don't always mean to do that, but the end of verse 10 may better fit with verses 11 and 12. So we'll have to see about that. I mean, I think that they do, but we'll have to see about how far we get tonight, is what I mean. Then 11 and 12 we probably will be looking at together. But then remember, we've got to intersperse between these verses any pertinent material that has been left out by the angel and by Daniel, such as the questions of the high priesthood, which we'll be looking at. And then I don't know exactly how we'll go, just various battles. Verse 13 all the way through 16 is one important war, not just one battle, but one important war. And then that only leaves you with 17 to 19, and then verse 20, getting down around 190, 187 BC, concerns Seleucus IV. So all that will be for the future. But anyway, verse 10, perhaps most of it this evening. So, the subject of verse 9, if you'll open up your Hebrew Bibles, we're going to get into that as well. The subject of verse 9 is the king of the north, not the king of the south. The king of the north is going to come into the realm of the king of the south, accomplish nothing in the year 240 BC, and consequently return home. Verse 10, English Bible, but his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come, and overflow, and pass through. Then shall he return, and be stirred up even to his fortress. Well, by now you're used to the language of Daniel 11. It's just totally confusing, and it means totally, absolutely nothing to you until you learn a little about it and study it. Just about someone getting mad at someone, stirring up, assembling some forces, they overflow to someone's fortress, and then they return and go back somewhere else. And it really doesn't supply much besides that. But that's a lot whenever you can know a little bit about secular history, or history from secular sources, and then compare that with the prophecies of the prophet Daniel. The time gap between verses 9 and 10 is 21 years. We've looked at a time gap between, verses 5 and 6 of 50 years, a half a century. The time gap's 21 years, so we're going to skip from 240 to 219 BC by the time we get down there. although we're going to have to add a few things in 221 and in 218, although you've got 219 and 217 on your chart. There are a few other battles that kind of have to be understood to understand what's going on here in Daniel 11. Okay, over to Hebrew Bible then. Now the first thing that we have to deal with is the first thing in the CA, and it's the first word, and it concerns this subject. Singular son versus plural sons. So we're going to look at this one phrase, English Bible, Daniel 11:10, but his sons. King James has plural, right? But his sons. The question is over plural versus singular descendants. And of course we also can raise a similar question, are we talking about sons literal, or are we talking about just descendants? Because as in the book of Daniel, it can speak of someone like, well, Belshazzar, Daniel chapter 5, as being a son of Nebuchadnezzar, when in fact he wasn't. But we know that the Hebrews can use that in a broader sense and have reference to a descendant and not just to a son. Well, that's not going to be the case here. We are going to be talking about the first literal descendants, whatever we end up with here, from this king, which will be the immediate sons of this king. So the question, or son, is over plural versus singular, and it has to be defined in two ways. First of all, by the grammar. And secondly, by the historical events. We're going to be looking at the grammar first. We'll get to the historical events whenever we get into the next phrase, shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And all we're concerned about now is this first word in verse 10, uvanal. So we're going to look at the grammatical aspect. Now, keep your eye there as well as trace your way down to your CA, verse 10, and the first comment, which comes under the letter A. You see it starts 10A, the Septuagint, Theodosian's edition of that, the Syriac version, the Vulgate, and so forth. Okay, we all there? Maybe not yet. Most of us are there. You see, you've got a rather long remark down there, a rather long comment in the CA. Now this becomes a little confusing because for the first time we have, in Daniel 11 anyway, we have footnote references to the Jewish Kari and to the Jewish Ketiv, which I'll just transliterate. For the first time we have reference to the Jewish Kari and Ketiv. They're very, very important, and they're going to be found throughout the Bible, throughout your Hebrew Bible. As a matter of fact, most of what you find over here in your margins, if you've wondered what all these little tiny scribbling marks are, on your right-hand page it'll be over in the right-hand margin, on the left-hand page it'll be over in the left-hand margin. That has to do with the Jewish Kari. Now, the Kari means that it's read, and that's what's found in the margin. The Jewish Ketiv means it's written, and that's what's found in the text. And they're really easy to confuse these two, and therefore not to realize, are we talking about marginal in the old Hebrew Bibles that the Jewish scribes wrote? Are we talking about marginal, it is read, Kari? Are we talking about in the text, Ketiv, it is written? Now that is what, in the first reference, 10a, you see you've got a Q, you see the capital Q and the capital K. That's what they have reference to, the Kari and the Ketiv. The Q, obviously, the Kari, Q-E-R-I, and the K to the Ketiv, K-E-T-I-V for pronunciation. So I'll briefly explain to you what these two things are. Let's see, do we have these, any explanation? Well, you don't have any explanation. You've got signs back there. I don't think these little inserts are notorious for no explanation. Just they give it to you and hope one of these days you'll get a dream about what it means. Then you'll understand it better. Well, if you're going to write them up, you ought to explain what's going on there.
Yeah.
You're expecting us to be able to read German and Latin and get dreams and revelations of what you're talking about in there. The keri refers, as I said, to the frequent remarks in margins or footnotes in Old Hebrew Bibles. And what they do, the keri, is they provide alternative readings. In other words, variants. You see, we're back to variants as we studied in textual criticism. They refer to alternative readings where the editor or the copier of the manuscript or whatever thinks that a mistake has been made in that which is written, which goes back in the text, which is the Ketib. Which is kind of like what, you've got right here in your modern day, 20th century Kittel Biblia Hebraica. You even have, you've got the Keri reading. If you go back up in your text and look at verse 10, and just go right through verse 10, that first line, it starts in the middle of the page, going left, and then go right on over into the margin. And then the word that's a little bit higher than the line, it starts with a vav, that will be the same word as down in your CA under 10A after your Q. It just doesn't have the vowel points. It's just the consonants there. Then there's a Jewish Keri reading. It's the alternative reading. Okay, is anyone not following what I'm saying? You all found where that is?
Amen.
Okay, that's what that little reading is over there. That's what a lot of these readings have to do with. Some of them are, some of them have to do with other things, but a lot of these are the old Jewish Keri readings. In other words, the little meanings behind the words, Keri, it is read, and Ketib, it is written, they say, here's the way it's written, Ketib. But whenever you get to that place, you can't touch the manuscripts because they're too holy. You can't change anything like that. But whenever you get to the place where it's written, Ketib, and you have this first word, uvanav, that we have in Daniel 10:1, then although that's what's written, the Ketib, read the Keri. It is read. So you read something else in the place of what you have in the text. Without changing it, you read something else in its place. So this is a long around through the back door and down the chimney way of explaining this, but I guess we have to say all of this, or we wouldn't know what these references are. And it's the first time that I remember anyway in Daniel 11 that we've come across here the Keri and the Ketib. So in the Ketib, they feel that, mistakes like transposition or haplography or dittography or homoiolutin, these various things we discussed earlier in textual criticism, that by means of one of these a mistake has been made. And rather than deal with the holy manuscripts here, then forget about what is written, just assume that something else is to be read and get the more correct form over in the margin or in a footnote. Remember what we're talking about. Singular son versus the plurality of sons. Now, one group of errors in the Keri, I think there are three groups of errors if I'm not mistaken, but one group of errors in the Keri has to do with omission. That is, a letter or a word or a phrase has been omitted. And there are various types of omission, various errors of omission in this first of, I think, three groups of errors in the Keri. And one type is when a yod is dropped before a pronominal vav that's found in a plural form, thus turning it into a singular form. And there are 113 cases of this in the Old Testament. 113 cases of the dropping of the yod before this vav from a plural form that changes it to a singular form. Okay, take your first word there in verse 10. There's no yod in it, is there? Or take, and that's really even a little bit different of a reading, go down to your 10a CA remark, go past the Kari to the Ketiv, and over to the Septuagint, not Theodotion's rendition of the Septuagint, but just the regular Septuagint. You've got a similar word, but again, no yod. But you either take the margin here in Kittle's text or the footnote and look for the Kari reading, and there you have your yod. So here's what they're saying, if you want to sum all of this up, down in 10a. Theodotion, the Syriac version, the Vulgate, and the old Hebrew manuscripts with Kari have singular son, or rather have plural. It's just the regular Septuagint that we get to next that has something different. Then just the LXX and the Ketiv have singular son. So you see, according to, these other translations and the evidence they're giving us, especially LXX, the Septuagint, it has singular son, then should this not be what we should have here in Daniel 11:10 English Bible? We've got sons plural there. That's not following what's written in at least the text, the Ketiv. It is written, not following the text of these old Hebrew Bibles. In other words, what you have in the King James, because it gives it to us there in a plural form. But what's so interesting about this is that even though the LXX does have singular son, which perhaps is based on the reading of the Ketiv that has singular son, what is interesting, and it's not true in LXX, just true in the Ketiv, is that the next two pertinent verbs are plural verbs in the Ketiv text. Which right away, that alerts whoever's studying it to the fact that there's been a problem in the historical transition of the text somewhere in time. Because obviously you just cannot have a singular subject with plural verbs. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, in English we don't have plural verbs. Well, we have plural verbs, verbs like to be, he is, but they are. But I mean, when it comes to action verbs, like what verbs are we talking about? Being stirred up and assembled. He assembled, singular subject, singular verb, they assembled. In English I'm talking about plural subject. Well, the verb form doesn't change though. He assembled, they assembled. He stirred up, they stirred up. Because we don't have plural and singular verbs in the action form of the verb like what is prevalent in Hebrew. In other words, your verb has to match your subject. And so even with Theodotion and the Syriac and the Kari and the Vulgate and so forth to boot, going the other way, just taking the Ketiv, something's interesting with the rendition that it has as singular because the next two verbs are plural. So, what we're saying is no doubt the Kari reading, as seen in both the margin and the footnote of your Bible, is correct, is the one that is supposed to be correct as opposed to the Ketiv reading. So on grammatical bases, we opt for the plural form. Not just because we're trying to follow the Kari, because it's not always true. But even in the Ketiv, as I'm saying, we've got the next two pertinent verbs are in the plural form, although the Ketiv has a singular subject. So that shows us that something is interesting, something's been tampered with, some type of mistake has been made. So that's from the grammatical point of view. From the historical point of view, well, we'll get to that here in just a moment. But before we can, we have to go on to our next phrase here, because it's going to draw us into the CA again, because it draws us into the LXX again. So in other words, we have semi-proven that sons is correct in the English Bible. We'll get to total proof here in a moment. Okay, the next phrase then. The next phrase, shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And your next two words in the Hebrew text are two verbs, to stir up and to gather. And you have your BV references, which takes you down again to the CA. And here the CA, in keeping with the LXX singular for son, makes these two verbs, stir up and gather or assemble, singular also. That's what the CA is doing. The LXX, remember we said, like the Ketiv, had singular son. Unlike the Ketiv, the two verbs that come after it are also singular, which they would have to be in order to make sense. Not so in the Ketiv. In other words, someone is accidentally or on purpose or for whatever reason, will obviously grant accidentally change the person of the two verbs or the person of the subject because they don't agree. So you have to kind of, do some thinking and reasoning and grammatically look at which way it could be. And I guess that's why I said we only semi-proved which way it should be as far as singular and plural. Because you could say, well, since the Ketiv has plural forms of verbs, maybe it was a subject that should be plural. Or you could say, since the subject is singular, this is what the CA is saying, because this is what the LXX did. Since we're going to take the subject to be singular, his son, then maybe someone made a mistake about the two verbs. The only problem with that is you had to make two mistakes with both of the verbs, instead of with only one word which deals only with the subject. In other words, you'd end up with, if you assumed that was the way in which a mistake was made and that was the direction toward which it headed, then you've got the son, he stirred up, and he assembled, he gathered together. Which would make all the sense in the world, but maybe we'll come across some more things historically here, which is what we're going to come into next. Let's look at the historical proof of whether it should be son or sons. And then we're going to show you what's meaningful through all of this. It's interesting. Again, because of the minute nature of the prophecy here. That's what's so very interesting. So that explains the second reference that we don't need to get into in reading all of that, but the second reference down in the CA is going to try to keep with the Ketiv and the LXX subject and not follow the Ketiv when we get to the verbs, but follow the LXX by giving us two singular verbs, stir up and gather or assemble, that will correspond to the singular subject. But we're saying since it appears that the subject should be plural, then the verbs should be left as they are in the Ketiv, which means that they're plural. Historically, here's the alleged problem, and this gets back to our chart. We know that Seleucus II does have two sons, Seleucus III and Antiochus III. Well, that's a point in our favor, in the favor of, well, the Ketiv, and what it seems to be implying with two pertinent plural verbs, because we have a possibility of a plurality of descendants, particularly sons, that could have application here in Daniel 11 and verse 10. But here's the alleged problem, historically, that the critics have had with this reading and why it's been so confusing and why I've spent as much time on it, about a half an hour, as a matter of fact, on this one word, sons, tonight. It says that his sons shall be stirred up. Now it means his sons, they. You don't add in a plural pronoun. That's to be understood. In Hebrew, you see, you don't have to have a plural pronoun, they. The verb tells you that it's plural. For us, the subject, the ending of the subject tells us whether it's plural or not. His sons. Well, that means his sons, they. Not his sons, he shall be stirred up. One of them. That'd be impossible. To have his sons, he shall be stirred up, and he shall gather great forces together. It'd have to be his sons, they. His sons. So we're talking about the next two sons in order. They shall be stirred up, and they shall assemble a multitude of great forces. Well, the contention is Seleucus III never did this. I mean, remember what we're talking about in verse 9. The king of the north has really suffered humiliation because he's made a counterattack 5 years after the Laodicean War upon the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. However, he's repulsed, nothing comes of it, and he goes back home. So it's his descendants, the sons of Seleucus III, Antiochus III, the two sons of Seleucus II, are angry. This stirred up means angry and excited Well, they're angry over their father's defeat. They're angry over the fact that the Ptolemies have really gained more control now. They have provinces up in Egypt. They've gained a lot of territory because of the conquest of Ptolemy III. Remember, he's the one who just overran the entire Syrian realm. They got a lot of it back after he went on home and was called back because of internal disorder. But a lot of it they didn't get back. And what they did seems to have been maybe taken away over a process of time between the years of 240 and 221 BC. But the contention is, and what can we do with this, that Seleucus III, you see how short his reign is there? He never had an opportunity. He never was engaged against Egypt. He never was stirred up against Egypt. He never assembled forces, and then he and his brother, or he first of all alone, and then his brother after him, Antiochus III, made an attack upon the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. Well, part of that contention is true, and part of it's not true, and the whole interpretation of it is what is false.
For the continuation of this message,
Well, part of that contention is true, and part of it's not true, and the whole interpretation of it is what is false. Yes, it is true that Seleucus III never made an attack upon Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom, situated and headquartered in Alexandria. That's true. So what are we going to do with the fact it says that his sons, they will be stirred up, and they shall assemble a multitude of great forces? Well, what Seleucus did do is what's important. He only rules for 2 years, from 225 to 223. He attacks the Egyptian provinces of the Ptolemaic Empire in Asia Minor, of all places, in around the year 223, the last year of his reign. He's assassinated on the campaign. During this campaign in 223, that's why you see him coming to an end and his brother coming to the throne. Inasmuch as we see him attacking what belonged to the Ptolemies, what belonged to Egypt, although it's a long way off from the mother country, then probably we don't have any, we don't have any inclination, there's no extant material by which we can gain an interpretation of what's going on in his mind. But the angel tells us through Daniel, assuming this reading is right, and the grammar and the history as they go together hand in hand seem to bear it out that it should be plural and not singular, the angel said his sons, both of them, both Seleucus III and Antiochus III, will somehow be involved in an attack upon Egypt. However, the first one not involved in an immediate attack, only the second one, as we're going to see here in the verse before we're through tonight, involved in an immediate attack. The other one probably just being a thorn in the side of the Egyptians, probably trying to take away a little bit of their territory to get his soldiers stirred up for, final assault upon Egypt, not with his brother because he is the king. His brother doesn't become king until he's assassinated. And of course, to gain a lot of slaves, to gain a lot of treasure, to gain property, to gain all types of things. So in a roundabout way, this seems to be what the case is, that Seleucus III, in a roundabout way, is making an attack upon Egypt because he's attacking the Asian provinces of the Ptolemaic Empire. So these are probably preparations that are evident of, a campaign in its initial stage that's going eventually to be directed against the heart of the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. Well, it's an aborted attempt because he's assassinated in the year 223. And that's about all we have to say about Seleucus III. His name means thunderbolt because he gained that in his attacks on the Egyptian provinces in Asia Minor. When he dies, his brother Antiochus is 18. Kind of like someone else, Alexander, fairly young, but becomes, by both of their names, Alexander the Great, Antiochus III the Great, becomes one of the greatest kings of the Seleucid Empire. And he will be the primary subject in verses 10 through 19. For the kings of the south In those same verses, 10 through 19, we'll be speaking of Ptolemy the fourth and Ptolemy the fifth. So Antiochus the third reigns a long time and will cover the two reigns of Egyptian kings, Ptolemy the fourth and Ptolemy the fifth. Okay, now let's cover something that we don't have here on our chart. Verse 10 we'll be getting into correctly, as it's stated here on your chart, the year 219, but some things take place before this. In the year 221, which really has to be added in on your chart to have the complete picture of what's going on and why it takes place. In the year 221, Antiochus III, his brother, has already made, evidently, initial preparations and gathered initial munitions and wherewithal against Egypt in a future battle, attacks Cilicia, which at this time is under the control of the Ptolemies. It's part of the Syrian province of the Ptolemaic Empire. He makes an attack upon Cilicia, which is in Lebanon today. You hear all the time in the news about Cilicia. That's the ancient name, C-O-E-L-E hyphen Syria. Cilicia, C-O-E-L-E hyphen Syria. It's the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, B-E-K-A-A. You hear about it in the news, read about it in the news all the time. Things are going on in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, B-E-K-A-A. The same as just the ancient form, the ancient name Cilicia, which is a Ptolemaic province at this time. He makes an attack in 221, which evidently is not what verse 10 is talking about. That probably is why it has been omitted from the chart, from being included there. But he's forced to withdraw by Theodotus, spelled just like it sounds, Theodotus, commander-in-chief of Egyptian forces in Syria, particularly in Cilicia or the Bekaa Valley. Now that's preparation for what's going to happen in verse 10. Okay, any questions thus far? We'll sum it up quickly and keep going on so we have time to get through most of this. His sons, English Bible, his sons, Seleucus III, Antiochus III. Now, they're not doing it together. This is not what he means that his sons together. Only one of them is king. One of them is just a kid brother. Antiochus is only 18 whenever his older brother dies. He's only 16 whenever his older brother comes to the throne. So he means, in a process of time, first of all. In other words, the angel sees, and Daniel's prophesying, because God's revealed all of this, that the first of these two sons evidently is only going to have a short reign. That's the interesting point, or one of several interesting points of the minute correctness of the prophecy here. Or why I say sons, because you don't have two kings ruling together. Generally, kings in the same family, brothers, one is the king and one is not, are jealous. That's where assassination happens most of the time with other relatives. You don't want them usurping the throne. So one of them stays alive. One of them is king. While he's king, he probably in the back of his mind is making preparations for an attack upon Egypt. You have to read this into what we have here, knowing what you do about history. He dies, but this son, it said, this son, we'll take it singular, this son will be stirred up and will assemble a great multitude of forces. And Seleucus III made initial preparation for that. Then he dies. Then his 18-year-old brother, Antiochus III, comes to the throne. We can read it again. And his son, which ends up sons plural, you see, because it gives both of them to us. His son, Antiochus III, will be stirred up and will assemble a multitude of great forces. And the first one to actually head in the direction of Egypt is the latter of the two, Antiochus III, by attacking Cilicia, Bekaa Valley in 221 BC. With that behind us, let's go on. The next phrase we'll look at, and shall certainly come. The Hebrew babul infinitive absolute, which you've got here in your text, babul, infinitive absolute, is what's translated, certainly, and it's a very strong way of expressing the definite determination that Antiochus III would have and feel in his heart upon attacking Egypt. So that's just a little grammatical tidbit about certainly. And shall certainly come. Even though, as we had just learned, he's been repulsed from attacking not Egypt, he hasn't gotten near Egypt, but Cilicia in 221. Babo, the infinitive absolute, means in a very strong way he's going to have it in his heart to make an attack upon Egypt. Now, the word supplied in the English Bible is the word one in italics. Now, this is where it gets interesting with regard to this half-an-hour study we've done on the question of plural versus singular sons in the beginning of the verse. Remember what we said, that the Ketiv evidently had made the mistake of having a singular subject, but the next two verbs, stir up and gather together, or assemble, were plural verbs. So we know he's talking about a plurality. You know what? As soon as we go beyond that, in that manuscript, and the Keri agrees with it, all the verbs switch to singular. That is probably the chief way that we know that the subject should be plural back in the beginning of the verse. The subject plural, the verbs plural, because the angel and Daniel through prophecy is having all of this revealed, and they're seeing all of this and detailing all of this, that two sons, Seleucus III, Antiochus III, initially will be involved in initial preparations against the Egyptians. Then as soon as you get past that, it's almost as though, and of course Daniel doesn't know all of what this means, but you see God can foresee history before it's, he could write a history book about tomorrow, you see. He sees one king is going to die, but both are going to be involved, but as soon as that one dies, then we've got to change all the verbs to singular because only one son is left. Very minute, particular prophecy here. The verbs, some of them plural, some of them singular, because he knows he's only going to reign 2 years. And when he dies, one son. So the one is supplied, and you kind of have to have that in English since we don't have plural and singular verbs, but shall certainly come is singular in the Hebrew. So we know he's talking about one man, one subject there. So the attack is made by Antiochus upon the Egyptian king Ptolemy IV. Philopater is his name. Now, Antiochus is one of the greatest of the Seleucid kings. Because he is, a large section of Daniel 11 deals specifically with his period of reign, verse 10 through verse 19. Because of that, I don't think we'll take the time to pause this evening and give you a lot of information about Antiochus III. He'll just come up every week from now on until we get through verse 19. And by the time we're through with verse 19, you'll know all the various deeds and campaigns and exploits and so forth of Antiochus the Great. Amen. However, we do need to give you just a little bit of information about Ptolemy IV Philopater, although we're going to give more because he still comes up again in verses 11 and 12. And verses 11 and 12, especially verse 12? Yes, verse 12 explains a little bit of his indolent nature and character, which we'll get to whenever we get to those verses. Philopater means lover of his father. And several people have suggested, Calvin not being the first, but maybe one of the best known, that he got his name in irony because he had his parents murdered whenever he came to the throne. So lover of his father, ha-ha, is what it's supposed to mean. He was terribly, terribly hated by his fellow citizens. So it's easy to remember. Antiochus III the Great was one of the greatest of the Seleucid kings. And how can we describe Ptolemy IV Philopater? One of the worst of the Ptolemaic kings. And evidently it's because of this reason, the indolent nature and character of Ptolemy IV Philopater, that the Seleucid kings, first of all Seleucus III, then Antiochus III, decide that the time is ripe to make an attack upon Egypt, because an attack has not been made by their father, who came before them for those years from 240 all the way down through 225. You see, you just have a blank period on your chart there. No more attacks made because Ptolemy the third was too strong of a king. Ptolemy the fourth, his son is another matter. So the most interesting thing we can say is the plural singular subject that we've been discussing in the verse. Now, through the rest of the verse, all the verbs switch to singular. And that's indicated by the addition of the italicized word one, O-N-E, in the English Bible. And one shall, babos, certainly come with definite determination of heart and spirit and purpose, and with great fury against the king of the south. Well, does it do any good? Well, let's look at some more phrases here. Our next phrase, and overflow and pass through. And overflow and pass through. Veshatav ve'avar. So we have the two verbs shataf and avar. Veshataf ve'avar. Overflow and pass through. That's the 10th verse, the second line in Kittle's text. The two words right in the middle of the line. Veshataf ve'yavar. Overflow and pass through. Well, metaphors are used, two metaphors. The verbs literally mean that, overflow and pass through, but the metaphor is that of a river. The angel says, like a mighty river overflowing its banks in a spring flood and sweeping through the countryside, so will Antiochus III come toward Egypt. The same, without looking in the Hebrew Bible, which may take a little time, Isaiah chapter 28 and verse 17. The same metaphor is used, I believe. Isaiah 28:17. Well, he's not so much speaking about an army, it doesn't appear here. We'll get to that, I guess, here in a moment. Judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies. Well, hail can't wipe away people's lives, so it's metaphors here. And the waters shall overflow the hiding place. Shataf shall overflow. Isaiah 28:17. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 28. His breath, as an overflowing stream, shall reach to the midst of the neck to sift the nations with the sieve of vanity. It's the same metaphor. Hold your finger there in Isaiah back to Daniel several times in the same chapter. So we won't have to cover this again, unless I think maybe the CA has references to it. We might have to look at it then, but we'll wait till then. Verse 22. And now it is speaking of armed forces. With the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him. Which you ought to be able to find this same word, shataf, or a similar form of it, which you do there in verse 22. First, second, third word. As well as verse 26. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow. And you'll find the same word there. When both words are used together, veshataf ve'avar, then it's under the figure of an uncontrollable river, but it definitely speaks of invading armies. As we just have seen from Daniel 11:22 and 26, sometimes only when the first word is used, veshataf or shataf, armies are under consideration. But whenever both words are used, it's under the figure of an uncontrollable springtime flood where a river overruns her banks. And as a metaphor, it speaks of invading armies. Isaiah chapter 8, back to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 8. Speaking of the Assyrian assault upon Israel, Isaiah 8:8, he shall overflow and go over, he shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings will fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. Speaking of the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom. Both of the words are used together. And they are both used together for a second time in the 11th chapter of Daniel in verse 40. You might want to look in your Hebrew Bible to find them, verse 40. The last two words, Veshatav ve'avar, as a matter of fact, the exact same form of the word, of the two words, which reads in the English Bible, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships. Now, verse 40 is not too boring like verse 10 might be to you, because verse 40 is end-time events, unlike verse 10. And he will enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass through. Shall overflow and pass through. That's just what we have in verse 10. An overflow and pass through. Historically, let me explain what we have taking place. Remember that much of the Syrian realm had been regained by Seleucus II after Ptolemy III was called back to Egypt because of internal strife, governmental problems. But all this time, the Ptolemies are still controlling Palestine. The whole time, the Ptolemies are still in control of Palestine. So this phrase, under consideration, and overflow and pass through, details Antiochus pushing through Palestine toward the Egyptian border in great fury, and initially in great military victory. The year is 219 BC. Now, remember we talked earlier that Antiochus III the Great, in the year 221, first of all, made an attack upon Cilicia, and he was repulsed by the Egyptian commander-in-chief of the Syrian realm, Theodotus. Now we have an interesting change of events only 2 years later. Theodotus transfers his loyalty from Ptolemy IV Philopator to Antiochus III the Great, which means that the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian forces in the Syrian realm now has mutinied to the other side, and he's gone over to the side of the king of the north. And when he did, then he just opened up the cities of Ptolemais and Tyre and gave both of these in the year 219 BC, and overflow and pass through gave both of these to Antiochus. Now you know that Tyre, that goes way down, almost down to northern Israel's border. This is what the phrase is speaking of, pushing himself and his armies, literally his way, like an overflowing, madly rushing river through Palestine, headed to the Egyptian frontier posts, which we'll get to later. And he's helped along the way by the abdication of Theodotus from his allegiance to the Egyptian king. But Antiochus gets this far, and he hears a rumor of a large Egyptian force that's gathering. You don't have all of this on your chart. Some of it, I guess, is assumed. So he accepts a truce that he signs along with Ptolemy IV Philopator and returns back home. Then in the year 218 BC, Nicholas, who is the new Egyptian general, marches up to Ptolemais, Tyre, Cilicia, Bekaa Valley, and defeats his former comrade, Theodotus, and his former and present enemy, Antiochus III, in the year 218. Which comes between the two dates that are supplied on your chart. Nicholas marches against Antiochus. And that leaves us then with the question of who this is in the end of verse 10. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Which fortress is it? Or is it a collective usage of the term, as we saw in verse 7? And to whom does it belong? His. The king of the north, king of the south, Theodotus, Nicholas, to whom does it belong? Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Well, the very things that are left off on the chart, the very things that I'm trying to supply to you right now, namely this skirmish that happens between these two dates, that happens in the year 218, maybe is to help us better interpret the end of verse 10 and how verse 10, especially the war that began in 219 and this skirmish in 218, is to be connected to the events in verses 11 and 12. So that's where we're going to stop tonight, because the end of the verse is going to help us pick up with verse 11, and I think will better fit with that. Although I don't think that the versions have it separated any other way, you kind of have to understand some of these things that come in between before we can understand how the connection is made, who's doing the fighting, who's doing the returning, and who and which fortress. Who does it belong to and which fortress we're talking about.